Welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm Cheryl Atkinson. Charges have been dropped against Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr., who was arrested last week for disorderly conduct. The incident has sparked national attention on police treatment of African Americans after Gates, who is black, was believed to have been breaking into a house, which turned out to be his own home. Joining me is The Root's Marjorie Valbrun, a conservative talk show host, Armstrong Williams. First, what is The Root? A sentence or two.
TheRoot.com is a web-based magazine that's owned by the Washington Post company, and it focuses on issues that are important to a mostly black audience.
And Gates is affiliated?
Yes, he is. In fact, he is the managing editor.
What is your take on this case, and what evidence do you think there is that racism was at play?
Well, I think that, the woman the passerby who saw them trying to get in the house said that there were two black men with backpacks breaking into the house. And so the police came on that assumption. And also, there was a pretty large police presence. I believe 6 officers came. And mind you, this was in broad daylight at 12:45 in the afternoon, where there were other people walking by. So I think that's what has spurred the outrage, and the fact that he was arrested after showing his ID, 2 forms of ID, and establishing that he was in fact in his own home. And of course, words were exchanged, and there's 2 different versions of what happened. We weren't there, but for a lot of black people, the whole event seems extremely familiar because a lot of us have been there.
Armstrong Williams?
Well, listen, I have tremendous respect for Professor Gates. I know him. Anyone who would have made that call, if it appears that someone's home was being burglarized, if it had been 2 white men, they would have said 2 white men are breaking in, or 2 black men, or 2 Asians, or 2 Latino-looking people. That is the description they would have given to help the officer. And if someone was burglarizing his home, and it was not the occupant of that home, the person was just being a good neighbor. Obviously, they did not recognize him. And see, something we forget about sometimes is that as familiar as Dr. Gates may be to us, there's so many people who have never heard of Dr. Gates and may not even recognize it, even young campus police. I think race was the last thing that came to mind. It's just mistaken identity. She did not realize that it was the occupant of the home. She felt she was doing her duty of reporting what appeared to be a crime, not realizing that he'd already called the locksmith.
Well, let me point out, he was, by his own admission, forcing the door open.
Absolutely.
There was a problem with the lock, so he looked,
it looked
I
that
think
way.
a lot of
It was
people might have
appearance.
assumed
Yes,
he was
it was
breaking
appearance.
into the house.
But to take this and turn it into an issue of race, I'm sure this was so humiliating and embarrassing for Dr. Gates. I really feel bad for him. But I also will fault him out of respect. If it were my home, and if the police had approached, because sometimes I leave my keys, my driver tries to help me get at my house, it has happened. If the officer had approached, if my neighbor had called and said 2 men were breaking in someone's home, I would have readily identified myself.
Let me say, we were in the control room talking about this case last night. There were 8 of us in there. 2 of us had this happen to us. Both of us are white. Similar stories where a neighbor called thinking we had broken into our own homes.
Yes.
I awoke about a half hour later to the police in my house downstairs calling out with their guns drawn, demanding to know who I was. And even when I established my residency, they still wanted to search the house to make sure there hadn't been a mistake and someone wasn't forcing me to say that everything was okay. Obviously it was inconvenient, but I didn't mind that the neighbor called, and I didn't mind that the police, I expected them to do that. Marjorie, one thing that seemed to set the tone for this case was, by his own admission, when Gates was initially approached and said, "Will you please step outside," by the officer, he said, "No, I will not." And this is before anything had been established as to what was going on. Was that a mistake on his part?
No, I'm not sure if it was a mistake. I think it was a judgment call that people have to make in the heat of the moment. I mean, I think that both sides probably could have handled the situation better, but he said that he didn't feel safe coming out there, that he felt a bit threatened. And I understand that feeling. I don't know what I would have done in that situation, but I felt like if I had already established this was my home, that that should have been taken as truth. And also,
well, how is the officer to know that's not, if he didn't recognize who he was, how is he to know? He can't walk away because someone inside a house where there had been a reported burglary said, I live here.
But he went inside the house with him at first, and he showed him the 2 forms of ID. And then when Gates asked him for his name and badge number, he refused.
Okay, good point. This is where on the police report the officer lost me a little bit. At some point the officer acknowledges he established his residency, whatever happened, I believed he lived there. The officer allowed this sort of debate and confrontation to escalate. Isn't the policeman supposed to be professionally trained to de-escalate a situation, not to let it get the best of him and result in an arrest of an entirely different charge, which he said disorderly conduct because he was making sort of a scene?
I absolutely agree with that. And I think that Marjorie and all of us realize that police officers are human beings. They make bad judgment. Sometimes their temper flares. And sometimes it takes an adult in the situation. Something my parents have always taught me and growing up, you may not like it, is that police officers are never wrong. They are trained, even though they may have drawn their weapons in your home, they're trained to use their best judgment. And I believe if I were to say to them, look, it is my home. I have photographs, I have pictures, here's my ID. Let's cooperate together. I understand you're doing your job. Obviously, you don't recognize me. Let's try to diffuse the situation. Obviously, and for good reason, Marjorie, Dr. Gates was irritated. He was very upset. So his contribution, his attitude, and lack of security, feeling secure, that someone was, how dare you suggest that I'm breaking in my own home, which was irrelevant to that officer of the law. He could have cared less. He was trying to do his job. Now, he did not do his job well in terms of what you just mentioned.
Once he knew
he lived there, his ego became involved. He became arrogant, and he decided, because obviously Dr. Gates was very belligerent, was very upset, and he probably said some things he probably later regret, and it escalated into what you mentioned in terms of the domestic altercation, and he was arrested. It was such an unfortunate situation, especially at this time in our country, having situations like this exist with someone of his stature, and already the existing reputation that the Cambridge police have at Harvard University. This is not the first incident, but still, Dr. Gates at all times was in control of the outcome of the situation.
Well, last point, the policeman, in my opinion, just having covered a lot of these stories, it's his responsibility to do what he can to make sure situations don't escalate. Gates was not armed, at some point did produce his ID, but according to the police report, he was saying things to the officer like, I'll talk to your mama outside, and accusing the officer of racism, presuming to know what was in the officer's mind. Isn't that racism on his part?
I don't know if it's racism. I just know that sometimes people act on their experiences. Like I said, I think both of them probably could have diffused the situation by simply being gentlemen and by saying, I'm sorry to one another, we're getting out of hand here. But if you are a person who has seen this happen all the time, when it doesn't seem unusual to you, when you've seen other colleagues from Harvard have had the same situation, when you know that you are looking at a police officer who's bigger than you, who's probably stronger than you, who has a gun, and there are 6 other officers on your porch, you're going to react a different way. And I think it's very hard for people who have not had this happen to them, who can't even imagine that happening to them, to relate to something like that. But I can tell you that lots of black people, particularly black men, but even black women, have had incidents with the police where they've been accused of doing things that they didn't do. And it's happened to me, it's happened to my brother, who was mistaken for a police officer, for a bank robber, and beaten by 4 officers to a pulp.
Thank you so much for that. And we could go on for a long time. It's time to wrap that up. But you made some great points, both of you, for this. Marjorie Valbrun from The Root and Armstrong Williams, conservative talk show host. Thank you so much for joining us and talking this out. On another topic, lawmakers said Tuesday that the House health care bill contains a hidden mandate that would allow taxpayer dollars to be used for abortions. Earlier, Washington Unplugged producer Michelle Levy spoke with Representative Bart Stupak, a Democrat, who helped draft a bipartisan letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and in it they're voicing opposition to the mandate. And she asked what he hopes to see in the House bill.
We want language in the legislation, H.R. 3200, that excludes public funds for abortion. Public funds for abortion. We want that very clear in the legislation, H.R. 3200, the health care bill that's going through the Energy and Commerce Committee. You cannot use public funds for abortion. If there is not direct language and we're denied our amendment, we will focus our attention on the rule. In other words, never allow the bill to come to the floor without our language being in it. And how many do I think? A minimum of 39 House members, 39 Democratic House members, I believe, would vote against a rule to bring the bill to the floor without explicit language saying no public funds for abortion.
So now you say that you've been in compromises with House leadership and Chairman Waxman. Can you explain a little bit how those negotiations are going and if you're optimistic about them?
Yeah, I've been in conversations with them. I'm optimistic we'll probably get an amendment in the committee. But even if we get an amendment in committee, and let's say the amendment fails to exclude abortions, let's say that fails, we're still insisting, because not everybody sits on the Energy and Commerce Committee, that we have a right to have explicit language in H.R. 3200 that no public funds for abortion. And if that's not in there, then we demand on behalf of the members who are not part of Energy and Commerce Committee that they have an up and down vote on this issue on the House floor as we debate health care.
In an interview last night with Katie Couric, President Obama said he would prefer not to wade into the abortion issue during his health care. Do you have a response to that, Congressman?
You can't not wade into it. I mean, if he doesn't want to weigh into it, then put our language in the legislation. Then I'm quiet. But you just can't talk about health care and reproductive rights and what you're paying for without discussing reproduction policy and coverages in health care. I mean, that's like saying, let's just leave it at that. I mean, you cannot not talk about it. It's central to all things we've been doing. Every bill they brought up, funding bill, I've been up to Rules Committee asking for an amendment, no public funds for abortion. Every time I go there, we get turned down. We are not even allowed to offer the amendment on the floor. And there are members who are not pro-life, who are pro-choice, but who think it is wrong of leadership to deny me and others the opportunity to express our judgment on this issue on the House floor where it should be debated. So I think if they do not have it in there, and if President Obama says we're going to have a bill with nothing in there on abortion, I think it's going to backfire. I think we bring down a rule, and it will be explicitly discussed in the health care plan one way or the other. We have to discuss it. You cannot ignore it. You cannot bob and weave. We have to discuss it. We have to have this debate, and this is going to be the bill. This is historic legislation, and we're not going to let it go without having this debate.
Would you say that it shows political cowardice on the part of the president not to want to wade into it?
No, it's probably somewhat good political judgment to try to avoid it, but you can't. And you know, the president was elected to make tough decisions, just like I'm elected to make tough decisions. These are tough decisions, but you don't run from them. Let's address them front and forward. I'd ask the president to sit down, let's discuss it. Give me my amendment. Let the will of the House work its will.
The question on everyone's mind is, will this get done by the summer recess? What do you think, and do you think the process is too rushed?
I do not think it'll be done by summer recess. Do I think it's too rushed? You know, being on the committee, and we've actually been meeting since January on this, back and forth, back and forth. So from where I sit, I don't think it's rushed. But now you're seeing compromises have to be worked out. Whenever they reach those compromises on how we're going to fund the bill, is it going to be quality-based or utilization-based? Is it fee-for-service? How are we going to fund it? What is the mechanism? Depending on when they do that, when that agreement's reached, you have to give members some time to look at it. You do have to give members time. Do I think we have a vote by July 31st in the House? No.
What about by the end of the year, as the administration is saying now?
Yes, I believe you can have a bill completed by the end of the year, signed by the president, provided he gives us our amendment.
Congressman Bart Stupak, interviewed by our producer, Michelle Levy. Thanks for watching Washington Unplugged on CBSNews.com. I'm Cheryl Atkinson. You can catch my Follow the Money reports on the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric. Hope to see you tomorrow.